Shalom Aleichem, Erev Tov, good evening. I cannot tell you how happy I am to finally be back in this shiurim. It has been a very long month and a bit since I last was sitting here teaching Torah, but I'm happy that we got an opportunity to learn together in New York. Thank you to everybody who was there and was part of that limud, and for all the subsequent phone calls and meetings since then. It's a pleasure. It was a pleasure being with you, and it's a pleasure being with you now too. B'ezrat Hashem. The topic that I wish to introduce today, and that we are going to be spending a significant amount of time discussing, is all based off of two words that Rabbi Uziel left us with last time. If you'll recall in his introduction to HaShofet v'Hamishpat, Rabbi Uziel was decrying the situation in which the Jewish people have abandoned our court systems for other court systems. And the words that he used, that the Jewish people never abandoned their court systems, v'darash b'chol artzot pezurav, and they demanded in all of their countries of exile, ha'autonomia hamishpatit shelo, their own political, legal autonomy. And I told you then that I would come back and discuss that topic, and for me it's absolutely crucial that before we go forward, we must spend time here understanding at its core what exactly we're talking about when we mean national political autonomy for the Jewish people. For those of you at Kehillat HaShamayim, or if you've been in the Shiviti Midrash for a number of years, you may have heard me discuss this topic before, touch on it before, but never in front of a camera have I sat down and discussed this topic at length. So B'ezrat Hashem Yitbarach, this will be a first for all of us. And for those of you who've been around before, so B'ezrat Hashem, Shanu Chachamim B'lashon HaMishnah, the way that our rabbis became Chachamim was they repeated what they learned, and they learned and they learned over again until, Baruch Hashem, they became Chachamim. So I want to start with a story, because why not start with a story? In the introduction to his book, The Gospel According to the Jews, Rabbi Dr. Yosef José Faur, who I'm going to speak about in just a moment, tells the following story. Did the Jews kill Jesus? Asked Chacham Faur. Were they in any way responsible for his death? Before I review the Jewish and Christian accounts on this subject, I must relate an encounter I once had with an Iranian diplomat. So this Iranian diplomat is sitting together with Rabbi Faur on a plane. It took place on a flight from Istanbul to Tel Aviv in the month of July during the mid-60s. At the time, Turkish Airlines did not have a kosher meal program. Nonetheless, I approached someone at the counter and asked him whether he could arrange for a kosher meal, since otherwise I would not be able to eat. The person in charge was Armenian. He was married to a Jewish girl and was sympathetic to my request. We spoke for a while, and then he made a note of my request. When I asked him how he was going to get me a kosher meal, he responded, "Don't worry, I know what to do." By the way, in general, in life, when someone tells you don't worry, that's exactly when you should start worrying. To my surprise, when it was time to check in for the flight, I discovered he had upgraded my ticket to first class. I got the window seat. Next to me sat a gentleman. He was an Iranian diplomat stopping for a short time in Israel. We spoke for a while. When they began to serve the food, I received two beautiful trays. One contained a green salad with olives, lemon, oil, salt, and pepper on the side to garnish. The other tray contained an assortment of fruits. Turkish fruits and vegetables are delicious. I don't know whether it was because I was so hungry or because of the excitement of the situation, but I still think that it was one of the best meals I had on any flight. And in parentheses, Chacham Faur writes, "Sorry, Elal." Apparently, the Iranian diplomat was touched when I told him that I kept a kosher diet. After the meal, he told me, "You appear to be learned. There is a question about Judaism for which I never could find an adequate answer. Perhaps you can enlighten me on this matter." He then proceeded, "How could you justify the Jewish killing of Jesus? Let me ask you that question. How can we justify the Jewish killing of Jesus? If I could just pause for a moment here. Did the Jews kill Jesus? Okay, I see some of you shaking your head no. And I know that many Jews for many years have been told that we haven't. And I don't mean, I see some people that are like Rabbi Oppenheim, who knows history very well. But at least according to the Sephardic tradition, seemingly that of the Talmud and the Rambam, the Jews did in fact kill Jesus. The problem lies in which Jesus and when did Jesus live, and the Christians believe in a Jesus that lived in a very different time period than the Yeshu HaNotzri of our rabbis. But let's just go with it that the Jews killed Jesus for the sake of this conversation. And if you'd like, I have a shiur, it's a private shiur, called Yeshu in the Talmud. If you want a link, you can always email me and I'll try to send it out. So how do you justify the Jewish killing of Jesus? You're sitting on an airplane. Someone asks you a very loaded question. A question for which Jews throughout history have been killed, burned on crosses. A fundamental trait of Sephardic tradition, says Faur, is Jewish national pride. I know that word, national pride, that phrase is complicated for people today. But it's a fundamental trait of the Sephardic tradition, Jewish national pride. Sephardim never permitted Gentiles to trample upon Jewish national reputation, or to treat the Jewish nation as some sort of international pariah needing to justify herself to a higher court of justice. Rabbi Chaim Palaji, one of the great Kabbalists, 1788 to 1896, one of the foremost rabbinic authorities in modern times, pointed out that humility, anava, which is a much prized virtue in Jewish ethics, quote, I'm afraid to read this in front of a camera. Anava, humility, must be reserved for internal relationships between a Jew and a Jew. Now I know you're sitting there looking at me saying that's not the kind of thing we normally hear Yonatan Halevi saying in front of a camera. So just hang in there. A Jew should treat Gentiles neither as superiors nor inferiors, but as equals, even when dealing with the highest aristocracy. So anava is the character trait in which we put ourselves as inferior to another person, some type of working on our midot with other people. But when it comes to people that are outside of our nation, we are not superiors, we're also not inferiors. We are equals. And we will engage with each other as equals, even when dealing with the highest levels of government. However, when I find myself in the company of the Gentile aristocracy, writes Rabbi Chaim Palaji, I feel a great aristocrat myself. Because we are the children of Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. If you wanted to look this up, it will be in the second volume of Birkat Moadecha L'Chaim that was printed in Izmir in Turkey. Chacham Faur now turns to the Iranian diplomat and asks, are you aware that at the time of Jesus, Israel was an autonomous state? I asked the Iranian diplomat. Of course, he responded. Did you know that Jesus was a Jew and a citizen of that state? Again, the answer was in the affirmative. Now, how would you respond to a foreign government or a foreign citizen demanding that you justify the right of an Iranian court of law to try an Iranian citizen? The same is true of Jesus. The Jewish people were and are an autonomous nation. Jesus was Jewish. And therefore, whatever transpired between him and the Jewish people is a purely internal matter. A Jew may indeed have the right to ask me about it, because he is a member of the Jewish nation. But to respond to the demand of a non-Jewish entity on this matter would impugn our autonomy and sovereignty as the nation of Israel. To which the Iranian diplomat responded, it is the best answer I ever heard. The best answer I can give you for why the Jews killed Jesus, it's none of your business. Chacham Faur writes, I believe he was sincere, and not just diplomatic. As a matter of principle, this is the answer I give to non-Jews. It is none of their business. Jews need not justify themselves to a bunch of hypocrites, guilty of the worst abominations in history, including the Inquisition, the mass genocide of, and he writes, I'm reading what he writes, Amerindians, that's American Indians, the largest in world history. But if you don't know the numbers of the Native Americans that were murdered in this country, the numbers are beyond what you know even in a Holocaust. And the extermination of 6 million Jews, counting among them over 1 million children. To this sort of people, Matthew's words fit best in chapter 7, verse 5 of Matthew in the New Testament. Thou hypocrite, first cast out the beam out of your own eye, and then you shall see clearly to cast out the mote out of your brother's eye. Chacham Faur gives an answer. The Jewish people were and are an autonomous nation. We don't owe answers to anybody outside of our nation. Just like we don't expect America to explain its policies internally to people on the outside, we don't expect the autonomous Jewish nation of Israel to do anything the same. Before I try to maybe soften the harsh blow that Chacham Faur just put out here, I want to, for a brief moment, make a statement about Chacham Faur, explain to you a little bit about who he was. I'm assuming that many of you, if you've been in this class for sure, have already heard of him. But for those who haven't, Chacham Faur was an incredible Talmid Chacham and an academic of this last generation. I've spoken in a video that I gave right after he passed away a little bit about the controversy that happened in his life and the injustice of it all. I don't think that makes his legacy or creates his legacy. I will say very clearly, I never studied from Chacham Faur. I didn't meet Chacham Faur. I don't purport to be a successor of the teachings of Chacham Faur. I'm not purporting to teach some pure Andalusian Judaism. I approach the writings of Chacham Faur with reverence and respect, and as a Talmid Chacham of the finest and the highest caliber in the Sephardic Jewish tradition, especially in the last 100 years. If I had to tell you what was Chacham Faur's greatest gift that he gave to the Jewish people, if I'd have to go out on a limb, I'm going to quote himself. In the beginning of his book, The Horizontal Society, Chacham Faur quotes another professor that taught alongside him at the Jewish Theological Seminary, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. Chacham Faur writes the following. Professor Abraham Joshua Heschel called attention to the devastating effect of the negative approach to Jewish studies. He quotes the following from The Earth is the Lord's, page 107. Says Rabbi Heschel, Judaism today is the least known religion. Its rare splendor has been so frequently adjusted to the trivialities of changing opinions that what is left is commonplace. There are only a few who still perceive the vanishing nigun of its perennial yearning. Judaism is the world's least known religion. Alarmingly, the reduction of Judaism, says Chacham Faur, to trivialities has affected some of our most distinguished rabbinic colleges. The upshot is what Professor, and I think you pronounce his name, Neusner, described as rabbis but no Torah. He began this essay with this eye-opening paragraph, and let me read it to you. The failure of the rabbinical schools, Reform, Conservative, Reconstructionist, Integrationist, Orthodox, it doesn't matter which denomination you put here, over the past generation, to set forth a coherent intellectual structure and system resting on Torah learning has produced a generation of rabbis with little or no Torah to teach. By Torah, I refer not to some knowledge of the Hebrew scriptures which the liturgy requires rabbis to gain. I speak of a basic philosophy, a core theology of conviction that coheres and that guides the everyday encounter with the crises of life, both public and private. If we had to look around ourselves at the Jewish world, it doesn't matter where you look, it doesn't matter. We can sense that rabbinic leadership lacks a basic philosophy, a core theology, something that coheres, something that can clearly guide us in all of the crises that we face, both personally and publicly and nationally as a people. In my opinion, there was no greater spokesperson for explaining coherently, consistently, basically in the most beautiful way. Basic is not simple. Judaism, especially that of our rabbis, as Chacham Faur, alav hashalom, who in all of his books, from beginning to end, you see not just an incredible encyclopedic amount of knowledge, different books and volumes and tractates of Chachamim and writings from the early times until the latest of times, but the ability to draw lines and connect all those dots and explain how this Judaism that our Chachamim gave us is coherent, it makes sense, it is consistent, and that so much of the confusion that we find inside of the Jewish community comes from a lack of knowledge of our tradition, a lack of understanding of how our tradition works, how it's supposed to look. And when it works well, it does wonders for Am Yisrael. And so, I think that's all I need to say about Chacham Faur. If you want to know more, I posted in the Google Classroom under Rabbinic Biographies some links if you wanted to read up or watch some shiurim or listen. I have to say that his son, Rabbi Faur, should live and be well, gives a tremendous amount of shiurim on the internet. He has a WhatsApp group you can join. Much of the material that we share here comes directly with the permission of Rabbi Faur. Hashem yarich yamav b'tov u'shnotav b'neimim b'ezrat Hashem. And without any further ado, I wish to crack open the PDF that I sent out, Rabbi Yisrael Moshe Hazzan, The Man and His Teachings. So, Rabbi Yisrael Moshe Hazzan is a rabbinic personality worth knowing. He was perhaps of the greatest Sephardic Chachamim that lived in the last few hundred years. When I say greatest, there's no thermometer I can put on a Chacham to know who was the greatest. But when you see the way that the other Chachamim of his generation and those that came afterwards revered him and respected his rulings, his teachings, it tells you that even they, the greatest of them, recognize his greatness. Unfortunately, though this PDF is titled Rabbi Yisrael Moshe Hazzan, The Man and His Works, we're not actually going to be spending a lot of time studying anything much about Rabbi Yisrael Moshe Hazzan, The Man and His Works. I can highly recommend the book. I can send you, it's a book in Hebrew, it's a PDF. I'd be more than happy to send to you. My edition, they've been out of print since the 60s, if I'm not mistaken. But the English introduction to this book by Chacham Faur is one that I find to be foundational. It's a fundamental read that we must read, and not just read, but study. For those of you in my Shabbat class, everything we're going to be reading here is only going to complement what we study on Shabbat afternoons for the last couple of months. So I'm on page 3. I think in your PDF that should also be page 3, but it should say the number 3 in the top right corner. Do you see that? Okay. Autonomy, rather than freedom, is the basic concept underlying the Sephardic tradition. Listen, Chacham Faur is a Sephardic rabbi. Not just a Sephardic rabbi, he's a very proud Sephardic rabbi. I think you know me long enough to know that I don't split up Am Yisrael into them and us, or Sephardim and Ashkenazim. We're speaking about Sephardic traditions because these are things we can clearly identify in Sephardic tradition. And things that I'm not convinced that contemporary Ashkenazi rabbinic leadership would be proud of. And therefore I don't purport to speak for Chachamim who wouldn't like us to speak in their name. autonomy rather than freedom is the basic concept underlying the Sephardic tradition. Autonomy means self-government according to one's own laws and values. A society is autonomous when the ordering of human conduct and the adjustment of human relations are relative to its own criteria and interests. It's very important, especially, I'm afraid to say it, in a country like ours, in the United States of America, in which you have one country that contains inside of it many, many cultures and subcultures, many different ethnic groups and religious groups. And we have this understanding here that all people are equal in front of the law, and that might be true, and I'm not here to speak politically about that. I'm not sure, though, that in our country we yet know to govern people based on their own cultures and their own values, and at least Am Yisrael. Am Yisrael has its own culture, its own values. And we would much rather autonomy than freedom. What does that mean? That means that as much as someone might say, oh, I'm from a German Jewish family, from a Russian Jewish family, a Moroccan Jewish family, an Algerian Jewish family, a Yemenite Jewish family, whatever Jewish family you may come from. Until fairly recently in history, your grandparents, my grandparents, were not equal citizens of the countries in which they lived. It's a very recent development that Jewish people were even offered freedom in the sense of be an equal citizen with us in this country. Yes, we lived in certain countries, but in those countries, Moroccan Jews weren't Moroccan, they were Jewish. They were Israelites. Only once they left Morocco did they become Moroccans. Who taught us better than the Germans that Jews in Germany were not actually Germans, as much as they thought they were, but they weren't. Only fairly recently did we received citizenship and the right to vote and so on and so forth, but that wasn't a thing in all of Jewish history. Wherever we were, we chose our autonomy, the ability to govern ourselves internally, over our freedom. It presupposes a law, and law is a capital L. The word for law in Arabic, anyone?
Sharia.
Sharia, very good. The word for Sharia in Hebrew? Torah. Torah. The law. We translate, and by the way, you should know, to be fair, in Arabic-speaking countries, the Jews, Torah was Torah and Sharia was Sharia, but the definition, what is Torah? There's a law, the law, capital L, it's the law. It presupposes a law, independent of political and religious bureaucracies, as the only source of government and authority. Spiritually, this concept finds ultimate expression in the idea of a historical berit. We're going to spend next week talking about the berit and how does the berit work and what's so special about the berit. But the berit is the covenant, or as Faur says, a bilateral covenant, freely entered by God and the people of Israel at the foot of Mount Sinai, and later reiterated in the plains of Moab. So we have a law that's a bilateral covenant. Who are the parties in this bilateral covenant?
Hashem and the Jewish people.
Okay, HaKadosh Baruch Hu and the Jewish people. So it's not an agreement of the Jewish people to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, or of HaKadosh Baruch Hu to the Jewish people, but it's a bilateral covenant that we entered in freely. Now, freely is an interesting word, because you know that rabbinic tradition discusses how not so free it was to enter this covenant, but let's not dwell on that particular teaching right now. This covenant established the law. What happened in the plains of Moab? Someone tell me what happened in the plains of Moab? What did we reiterate? How did we reiterate the covenant in the plains of Moab? Where's my father? On Shabbat he was telling us about it. Ham, I'm looking at you. You're my Tanakh expert here.
So what happened in the plains of Moab at the end of the Torah, I mean, where they reiterated the brief? They read the Torah again, and then they wrote more of them. They wrote more copies, and they gave one to each tribe. And everybody said that they were going to accept the Torah, and then when they were prepared to go into the land of Israel.
So this is a follow-up to Har Sinai.
Of the breed, and they finally wrote down the whole Torah. Well, maybe except for the very end, but up until that point.
Very good. So we have the Har Sinai, and then we have the plains of Moab. Those are two very important moments in our history. Thank you very much. This covenant established the law, with all the norms and regulations that govern the people of Israel. In footnote 1, Faur asked you to see his article, Understanding the Covenant. At the end of today's shiur, will pop up in your Google classroom. So it'll be posted, and you're more than welcome to read it before next class. Accordingly, the autonomy of Israel is the effect of the covenant, and it is guaranteed by God and the people. This covenant is sacred and eternal. As sacred, the law does not depend on promulgation and cannot be subject to abrogation by any authority, human or divine. No one can change this Torah. When the and he quotes here Law and Justice and Rabbinic Jurisprudence, that article is also going to pop up in your Google Classroom at the end of today's shiur, and you are highly recommended to read that article before next week's shiur. When the biblical prophets charged the king and the priest, the Kohen, in the name of the law, they were in fact postulating the belief that the values governing Israel lie beyond political authority and ecclesiastical bureaucracy. Ecclesiastical, that's an interesting word, by the way. Do you know the word ecclesiastical? Somebody here has the name. How do you say Ecclesiastes in Hebrew?
Kehillat.
Kehillat, right? Kehillat. The word Kehillat, that's why it's an interesting word to look into, how it developed and how it's used, and also its parallels in Hebrew. The law is the ground for governing an authority, not its effect. And therefore the law is operative independently from government and political bureaucracies. Where did you see that recently in the Torah reading? You really saw a situation where a politician decided that they were better than the law. Because politicians are better than the law. You have to follow the law. But I'm a politician. I can do whatever I want. I'm from the ruling class. Where did you find that very recently in the Torah reading?
Must be in Zimri.
Very good. Very good. Tell me the story.
Zimri was the chief of Shimon, and he felt that he was allowed to go and take a Moabite woman, just like Moshe did, and kind of threw it in Moshe's face, and so that he can also marry a Moabite woman or take a Moabite woman.
Very good. And Midianite woman. And Pinchas, what does Pinchas do? I'm not advocating now for zealotry, but what does he do?
Spears them.
What is the statement that Pinchas is trying to make?
Anyone can't just take up and rule by themselves.
It doesn't matter who you are. You are also bound to the same laws that we are bound to. We are all in this together. There is no vertical leadership in the Jewish people. We live in what is a horizontal society. That is the way the Jewish people work. We are all equally bound to listen to the law. Who else has to listen to the law? HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The audacity, by the way, of the Jewish people to consistently, throughout our teachings, demand from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the creator of the universe, to listen to his law is fascinating. It's something that it's a real study in Jewish chutzpah, but really in what makes Judaism Judaism. That we can hold God accountable for things based on the covenant that he also entered into. Here, we also have in the recent Torah readings the exact opposite. We find that the law and politicians are working together so beautifully to corrupt the world. Tell me where you saw that recently in Torah reading. You find the first chief rabbi employed by a government. Somebody here read the Torah in the last few weeks. There was
Torah or Nevi'im?
Torah, no, in the Torah. There was a man named Bilam. Who was Bilam?
prophet to the non-Jews.
He was a prophet to the non-Jews. Very good. I'm just going to point out that though the majority of our traditions tell us that Bilam was a prophet, the Rambam and the Moreh Nevuchim makes it quite clear that Bilam wasn't exactly a prophet, but it's splitting hairs. Mamash splitting hairs. I know you know that. I'm just sharing for the sake of knowledge that Bilam was a very holy, spiritual person, if I had to use English words. Bilam decides to do something incredible. Bilam fuses the church and state. He takes a job. What's his job?
He's an oracle to the non-Jews of Moab.
That was okay. Bilam was allowed to do that part.
But he got paid for it.
A freelance.
It's
I'll
not
give you money and cattle and all the rest of it.
okay, but by who? Yitzchak, tell me what you were saying.
I was saying he was a freelance prophet. He didn't do it for Kavod of Hashem. He did it
He was
for profit.
he was a
Going to twist it.
okay, so it's a spiritual leader who makes money. But he makes money from who? Who's paying him? Who hires Bilam? Balak. Here you find a political leader, a tyrant, hiring a religious leader to work for him. It's the first chief rabbi.
Very common these days.
Today, this is normal. You find a corruption of religion, of godliness, of divinity, whenever politicians think that they can control the word of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. You see this all the time in politics. People manipulate all kinds of spiritual and religious traditions to make themselves sound like they're the next Mashiach of the world. Balak is using Bilam. And Bilam and Balak are the epitome of what happens when there's corruption with church and state. But you know, it's important when you study the Torah, very important when you study the Torah, not to study Aesop's fables. I mean, there are a lot of stories in the Torah. People read stories and love the stories. They read all kind of Midrashim on the stories. But there are very important lessons that are more important than the fantastical stories. They're not hidden. They're right there inside of the Torah that are intended for us to learn from to our everyday life. And Bilam and Balak, Pinchas, Zimri, these are stories that are very, very important to understanding the way in which halakha works. On page 4, likewise, national integrity is the effect of the internal legal institutions governing the people, not of their ability to control a particular geographical area. This is going to be painful, a little bit, especially to those of us who are very proud of our accomplishments in recent history of acquiring back the land of Israel for ourselves and creating a state of Israel. Understanding Galut, exile, and Geulah, redemption. Yes, the land is a part of it. But more important than holding on to any geographical territory or land is the effect of the internal legal institutions creating national integrity. This idea of national autonomy may be described as the theological, political form of government in contradistinction. Yochanan, I'm not a lawyer. You should read this for me. With the political, bureaucratic form of government in which absolute sovereignty constitutes the basis of authority and establishes the right for the civil and criminal administration of justice. What did I just say in English? If none of us understand English, then we're okay. I can just keep going to the next sentence. Who is the law? Yeah?
It's a different system. On one hand, you have the British system. Let's say where the king has the authority from God to govern, and that gets transferred within a structure of government. And in the Jewish national model, it's quite a little bit different. Although the British system is, or this idea of the monarch being ruling via God is modeled the same, but what Faur was saying is a totally different setup.
You know, the king walks around in Jewish tradition with
A Torah scroll.
a Torah scroll, always, everywhere. Now, I know that this didn't always work in Jewish history, so Yochanan, thank you for explaining that. We find, if you open up our Tanakh, you're going to find dozens and dozens of kings who may have walked around with Torah scrolls, but they didn't even attempt to walk the walk or talk the talk. They were just outright violators of the Torah and human rights as it goes along with it. But in an ideal Jewish model, even the king recognizes that his authority is not because he's the king, but because of the law, because of the Torah, because of the creator of the universe. Maybe not even that, by the way. I will speak about that soon.
There's terms for that. It's like that the law here is a priori, not a posteriori. In other words, the law precedes the government, not that it's the result of the government.
That's right. Can I pause here for a moment? Can we jump to another PDF? Are you okay with that? Will it get too confusing, or we can try?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, I attached another PDF to the Zoom invitation from the Horizontal Society. It says the Horizontal Society, maybe section 2, chapter 5. Do you see that? Are you with me? You see the Horizontal Society? The PDF? Turn with me to page 51 in the actual numbers, not the PDF numbers. So just say the bottom of the page, 51.
I'm afraid I didn't find either of the two that you sent.
Okay, and the bottom of the Zoom invitation, it should say the Horizontal Society, section 2, chapter 4. It should say chapter 5, but chapter 4. Do you see that? It's really chapter 5, but it's a mistake.
That's okay.
Did anyone find it?
You have to follow the Google Classroom link.
So if you go...
It's one of the files that's downloadable there.
Very good. Okay, so it's one of the downloadable files. It says the Horizontal Society. Click it over there, page 51. The Brit. The Brit involves mutuality and consideration. At Sinai and Moab, the people agreed on their part to follow a set of rules and regulations. God, on his part, will extend upon them his special care. Transgression of the terms of the national berit at Moab, as in all contracts, involves sanctions and penalties, but not the dissolution of the covenant. This is very important. We accept upon ourselves that when a party violates the berit that we made in Moab, that we are going to be responsible for whatever sanctions are written inside of that contract, but it will not involve the dissolution of the covenant. We don't become unchosen and someone else chosen instead of us because we did not follow the covenant. In fact, God assured Israel that no matter what, he would redeem them and restore them to their land. To confirm this promise, God confirmed that he had, quote, promised in a solemn oath to your fathers, to Abraham, to Yitzchak, to Yaakov, to give them the Holy Land. In the blessing pronounced by Moshe before his death, he reminded the people of the Sinai and Moab covenant. First, he reminded them that God gave them the Torah at Sinai. Then he reminded them of the covenant contracted at Moab in the presence of the entire nation. And at that supreme instant, a king was installed in Israel. You're familiar with this king? We have mentioned earlier that at Moab, God had made his presence manifest from within the ark of the law. Aron HaBrit. Out of that Brit, HaKadosh Baruch Hu was manifest. Therefore, as noted by Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, Rabbi Yehuda Halevi is who? The author of? The Kuzari. He's quoted by Rabbi Avraham ibn Ezra in his commentary on the Torah. If you wanted to find it yourself, you go to Devarim, chapter 33, pasuk 5. Rabbi Yehuda Halevi says that the king installed by the people was none other than the Torah itself. What I'm reading to you now should be dangerous to you. And it should be something you've never heard before. Or if you've heard it before, you've heard it from here. Who is the king of the Jewish people? The Torah. In this connection, it is particularly illuminating to note that the place where the Torah is deposited at the synagogue, behind me, I know that in American Jews call this the Aron HaKodesh. I know that that's what they call it, but it's not what it's called, right? We all know that this is not an Aron HaKodesh. This is called in Hebrew the Hechal. The Hechal. The place where the Torah is deposited at the synagogue is called Hechal. What is a Hechal? A palace of residence of the sovereign. Who lives in the Hechal? A king lives in the Hechal. The word Hechal is used throughout the Torah, throughout the rabbinic literature, to refer to a place where a king lives. Why would we call this place the Hechal? Because in this ark lives the king of the Jewish people, the Torah. This term signals not only God's heavenly abode and his temple in Jerusalem, but also the official residence of pagan monarchs. And you could look up all these sources if you wish to see the usage of the word Hechal. By designating the place of the Torah Hechal, every single synagogue is in fact proclaiming that the law is Israel's supreme authority. So who is the king of the Jewish people? The Torah. And every community that you go to in the world that has a Hechal and puts inside of that Hechal the Torah is telling the world, we recognize that this law is our king. There's a halakha that I see many people, I'm now taking a tangent in halakha, people are not careful with. Particularly Sephardim. Ashkenazim are much more particular with this than Sephardim are. You should know, Sephardim also make mistakes in halakha. But especially here. Inside of the Hechal, what are you allowed to put? What can be placed in a Hechal?
Only Sefer Torah.
Only the Sefer Torah. What about a book of Haftarot?
No.
No. What about your Siddur? When you are there to open the ark, so you put down your Siddur inside? No. What about your Chumash? No. What about the Hechal is not a place of storage. The Hechal is the palace of the king of the Jewish people. No one is allowed in there. Nothing is allowed in there. Only the Torah. You show in general, I see in Sephardic communities, they have this Haftarah book. You know what the Haftarah book is? It's not like the Ashkenazi Haftarah book. Ashkenazim who have Haftarah books, they have real parchment. It's like a whole book of Yechezkel in parchment, a whole book of Yirmiyahu in parchment. I'm not talking about that. The Sephardim have something else. What do they have? It looks like a Torah. It's like all decorated outside, gold, silver, whatever it is. It's smaller a little bit. It's in a box, and inside is like printed all the Haftarot, and they keep that inside of the ark. They auction it off. They give it to the kids to carry around. Everybody goes to kiss it and they throw candies. And I'm not taking away children's participation in the community. I just think that when you walk around with your Chumash, nobody comes and kisses your Chumash. I mean, your Chumash that you're holding is much holier than a random book of printed Haftarot that's in a silver case. And then they auction it off. People pay money to take out the book of Haftarot. They keep it inside of the Sefer Torah. It's a mistake. Okay, it's a mistake. Back to our purposes. The king of the Jewish people is the law. I'm back in our original PDF. The survival of the people of Israel is a direct result of this belief. So I'm back in Rabbi Yisrael Moshe Hazzan PDF. As they were losing all forms of earthly power, they became more and more aware that their national integrity was not predicated upon territorial sovereignty. Why? Because we were losing our land. We recognized that very soon the words of our prophets would come true. We wouldn't be in Eretz Yisrael anymore. But even if we would be in Eretz Yisrael, we wouldn't be governing ourselves anymore. We would be under occupation of other governments. and that the bureaucratic political system of authority is incompatible with the idea of berit. It is pertinent to know that Galut, exile, in the Sephardic tradition, is principally a political concept. Yes? In its barest form, it means that the Jewish nation was not dissolved with the territorial loss of its homeland. Accordingly, the Sephardim viewed themselves as members of the Jewish nation rather than of the Jewish religion. Do you remember when I asked you to research all of these words, melech, king, nasi, prince, resh galuta, the exilarch, the nagid, the head of the community, the chacham bashi? You remember these words? The chief rabbi, you remember? I asked you to research these words. In all of those places, at least, I can't speak for everyone, at least Sephardic Jews maintained their political national autonomy everywhere they went. It didn't matter if you were in Egypt. It didn't matter if you were in Iraq. It didn't matter if you were in Morocco, in Turkey. The Jewish people governed themselves. Yes, we did pay our taxes to the non-Jewish government collectively on behalf of the Jewish nation. You'll see that when the Jews come to New Amsterdam, their letters back and forth are on behalf of the Jewish nation, not just on behalf of a Jewish community. We're not a community, we're a nation. We're a nation that expects that the world should recognize our sovereignty, our freedom to, yes, though we are in a physical exile, but to govern ourselves internally, autonomously. According to, what did we say in the beginning? According to our own laws and values. Relative to our own criteria and interests. There is a law, like Hebrew national hot dogs. We answer to a higher authority. No matter where we are in the world, we demanded our freedom to not be equal citizens of a country. We demanded our freedom to be autonomous. And that meant that if you had gone to a bedin in Morocco, Jewish people went to bedin because non-Jews recognized that they didn't preside over our court cases. We did. Still until today. If you go to Morocco, to a court, there are signs. Muslims enter here, Jews here. Jews don't go to Muslim courts of law. The reason? Because we have the right to govern ourselves. When did we lose the right to govern ourselves? The moment that we accepted this illusion of freedom. If we wish to be equal citizens of the nation in which we live, now we lose the right to govern ourselves. Yeah, so religiously we can do all kinds of things. Think about America. America is the greatest example of freedom and equality that Jewish people have ever been given in history. In this country, you are free. You and I are free to worship, to pray, to dress as we wish, to observe as we wish. You are not free, though, to run your own internal courts of law. I'm not talking about conversion or a religious ritual of giving a get, monetary laws, capital crimes. We gave up the right to govern ourselves in order to become equal citizens of the world around us. Our Chachamim would have never made that choice. Our Chachamim saw in our tradition something so magnificent, so powerful, so liberating, that no illusion of freedom could replace the gift of our having our own autonomy. Ironically, in the Sephardic tradition, the first time in Sephardic history where Jewish people stopped governing themselves according to their own law and interests, happened in 1948. When the office of the chief rabbis closed, when the Chacham Bashis closed, when we came to Eretz Yisrael, and now we gave up our right to govern ourselves according to the law that is in the Hechal, and instead to some hodgepodge of British law and Turkish law and remnants of ancient Jewish law that's invented every other weekend in the Knesset. And if we talk about Galut, exile, as the loss of our political autonomy, and redemption as the regaining of that, then maybe the words of Galut, Geulah, especially in this time period of the 3 weeks, where this seems to be on everybody's mind, the building of the Beit HaMikdash, the bringing of the Mashiach, all kinds of fantastical things people want to talk about in fantastical terms. But maybe we've been defining these words incorrectly, not in accordance with our tradition. And therefore the things we're hoping for may never happen because we're not going to do the work that it takes to bring about what actual Geulah looks like. And I say those words with pain because I sat here on Shabbat with my community and we studied together the writings of Rabbi Bibas, who shared with us the teaching, the argument between Rav and Shemuel. You must be familiar in Masechet Sanhedrin. Rav and Shemuel have an argument about when the exile will end and the redemption will come. Rav says, Kalu kol hakitzin. All of the end of time moments that our rabbis predicted, they're all over. They've all passed. They've all happened already. But when is Rav writing this? About 150 years after the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash. Give or take. Rav says, Kalu kol hakitzin. The only thing that is left is teshuvah. And I shared on Shabbat the teaching of Rabbi Bibas that Teshuvah is not some internal spiritual awakening. Teshuvah is a national return to the land of Israel. Because nationally, there's not one crime we've all committed. We're not all observing or not observing Shabbat or Kashrut or Lashon Hara the same way. The one thing we are guilty of is a lack of return to Eretz Yisrael. The Teshuvah is a literal return, a national return, a political return to Eretz Yisrael. Shemuel argues. Shemuel says, no, it's not true. What Rav is saying is not true. Shemuel says that the Galut itself is a suffering that we have to go through, and until HaKadosh Baruch Hu decides we've suffered enough, the teshuvah, the redemption or the return to the land of Israel cannot happen. And I think that if you look at Jewish history, we've definitely had both of these approaches in Am Yisrael. How frightening would it be for us if all of the galut that we had endured for the last 2,000 years, like the one we're sitting in right now, I'm in San Diego, Cheva, I'm choosing to be here and not in Eretz Yisrael. I'm saying my sins on camera. Just like all of us are choosing to sit where we're sitting right now. What if we could have ended galut 150 years after the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash? What would have happened then? All of the suffering of the exiles that we claim were God punishing us and divine consequences for our sins of... What if all of that was a self-imposed galut that we could have changed back almost 2,000 years ago? When Maran, Rabbi Yosef Cairo, goes to Israel and along with his rabbi and his colleagues try to establish a Sanhedrin, they were convinced that they are the return to Eretz Yisrael. They were not waiting for some Mashiach to come. They believed, listen, we have to just get up and go back to Israel. And they did. And what they did there was attempt, the purpose of a Sanhedrin was to attempt to reestablish political autonomy for the Jewish people in Eretz Yisrael. And I have to leave you with that thought until next week. To recognize what it is that Uziel was talking about, what Chacham Faur is beginning to share with us. Next week, I want to take apart this idea of Berit. I'm a little nervous about it because it's a big topic, it's a big conversation. I don't want to get lost in it, but I feel like if we're going to study together the laws of Sanhedrin, and we're going to discuss about the way that Jewish society would govern itself, if we're going to spend time like we did in New York discussing what an ideal Jewish police system would look like, all of that comes from a place of understanding that Galut is when we don't have the freedom to govern ourselves in the way that we believe is correct. And redemption would be the exact opposite of that. And the only way to redeem ourselves, the first step, would be to understand and internalize a system of law that frees us, that does not show tyranny face of favor, that does not allow for corrupt kings and leaders, both religious and political, to abuse us, to take away our freedoms, does not even allow for a God to hurt us. Because if HaKadosh Baruch Hu were to go against his covenant, then he would be no different than any other tyrant in the history of all the evil, tyrannical kings and people of power of the last thousands of years. We believe in something completely different. And B'ezrat Hashem, next week, God willing, I look forward to exploring that together with you. In just a few minutes, a few articles will pop up in your Google Classroom. Until then, I want to wish you all a wonderful evening. I'm here to answer any questions or comments you might have. Thank you so much for learning with me. B'ezrat Hashem Yitbarach. I look forward to continuing these shiurim all the way through until the high holidays will make us take a little bit of a break. But B'ezrat Hashem, thank you for being here and thank you for learning.